A lot of you have been praying for my friend, Father Jim, who I've talked about in homilies. He's one of my mentors and heroes from growing up. And he had a bump under his tongue this spring. And he had it tested, and it turned out to be one of the most aggressive forms of mouth cancer there is. So back in late May, he had the cancer removed in an 11-hour surgery, and he had to have his tongue reconstructed. And the tongue is made, half of it is made from tendons from inside his forearm. So it resembles a tongue, but it can't taste, and he doesn't have full control over it, and he can't talk like he used to. So I found myself, as I was preparing for this weekend, cringing, thinking of him, reading this gospel that he's read so many times over the years of his priesthood, about the man with the speech impediment and about what it meant to him this year. A good priest always wants to be one with the people. It's not good if the people are going through stuff down here and the priest is going through this. The priest, in order to relate to the people, has to be like the people. Pope Francis says it's the smelling like the sheep thing. You know, we should smell like the sheep. We should know the smell of the sheep and share it. So I understand that idea of whatever happens to the people of God, we're not exempt from it. But I thought, whoa, he's a preacher. Preaching is an essential part of who he is and what he does. So the thought of him losing his ability to speak, it's just so painful. I met with him over the summer a couple of times, and he said, you know, I've been a priest a long time. I've always known about disability. I've always ministered to people who've had disabilities. He said, but now I'm disabled. He said, it's so strange to be like, oh, now I'm one of those who's disabled. We know in the story today that Jesus healed this man with a speech impediment. And it leaves us the question, why do some people get healed? How come some people wind up being healed like this man? And other people don't. They die of their afflictions. Or they struggle for the rest of their life with something that the rest of us don't even like to think about, much less go through. It strikes me that this man lived this hard life, but he had no idea that in his future, he would be relieved of his speech impediment. And Father Jim had no way to know that later in his life, he'd receive a speech impediment out of nowhere without being able to predict it at all. It makes us wonder, is God at some control panel making all these things happen somewhere far away? Something we have to acknowledge that is an essential part of faith is that we're never going to understand all this stuff this side of heaven. I can't get up here and tell you a definitive answer to all the mysteries of life. That would be arrogant and unfair. We're not going to know that till we get to heaven. But Jesus says the most important thing to the man today. He says, Ephatha, which means be open. Be open to whatever's going to happen. Be open. We have no idea which version of life is going to be offered us. But if we can be open to working with God with whatever we get, we're going to be in a much better position to live joyful lives. We had a funeral here this morning for Elaine Samo. She lived to be 96 years old and had a little house that she got to stay in all the way through her life on Murdoch. And her adult sons, who graduated from SMA, were the reason that she was able to stay there. They helped her in countless ways through her illness. One thing that she had no way to know was that when she was a young retiree, she and her husband would be on a bus trip, and he would die in the seat right next to her out of nowhere. She had no way to know that she was going to be a widow for 25 years. And I think about that sometimes when I'm marrying a couple and they're standing on this carpet giving vows to each other. Sometimes I'll think, I wonder which one will be widowed. I wonder who's going to be the widow and who's going to be the one that goes. We have no idea what our role is going to be. And Jesus says, be open. Trust God to handle this. Don't try to overthink things. Don't try to control things. Know that there's many things we're not going to understand until heaven. Another part of this is we have to acknowledge that all of us are constantly in need of some kind of healing. We all are just a little bit off in one way or another. Even on your best day, you probably have a hangnail. My throat is not perfect today. I hope it's not going to develop into anything, but I've got that little tingle that tells you, And I think all of us know what it's like to go to work with a headache. You got a headache, but you're going to go there anyway. And a lot of us would not cancel our plans to go to our niece's wedding just because our foot is in a boot. We go to the wedding with our foot in a boot. And part of us is unwell. That doesn't mean we're all unwell, but a lot of us have parts of ourselves that are unwell that we have to carry. I always think about what it's like for someone who just survived a breakup to go to a big joyous event. You know, how hard it is if you're going to a wedding that you agreed to last year and you just broke up with someone and you have to go to this wedding with a broken heart. But that's part of how life is. We're not always going to understand why some people are healed and others aren't. We know that eventually all of us won't be healed because there's no one living on earth who's 150 years old, is there? Eventually, all of us succumb to something. And so there's got to be a mystery to that pattern. But when we look at someone like Helen Keller, at first look, we can say, how cruel. How could God allow someone to be blind and deaf, locked in that world? Why didn't God heal her? But we know that she's talked about even today. If God had healed her in the way that we thought she needed healing, she would have lost her ability to help the deaf to hear and the blind to see. She became an inspiration for everyone who deals with illness and disability. But in order to do that, she had to not be healed. My friend Father Jim, the one with the tongue cancer, told a story in one of his homilies once that always stayed with me. He was always very present to people who had some significant challenges. And there was a house in his parish that was for people with profound disabilities, people who really couldn't be at home. There was no way for their loved ones to care for them. So there was a man there, one of the nights he was visiting, named James. And James was completely paralyzed and nonverbal. The only way he could communicate was by moving his eyes. He had to be fed, he had to be changed, he needed help with everything. But he had a little computer communication system with him, so you could ask him a question and he could answer with his eye movements. So Father Jim, years ago this is, asked, "Do you believe in God?" And he blinked yes. And he said, "Do you believe in heaven?" And he blinked yes. And he said, "James, when you get to heaven, what are you going to ask God to be different about you than you dealt with here?" And through his communicator, James said, "When I get to heaven, I am going to ask God that I no longer be bald." We don't know the kind of healing that people most need. We have no idea what is most important in our quest for healing. James wanted to not be bald anymore. And I don't know if he was willing in heaven to live with his disabilities. We have this image of heaven being a place where we'll overcome all of that. And may that be true. But he was accepting life on life's terms. So a question for each of us is, what part of you, what part of me most needs healing? What is your area that most needs healing? Is it physical? Do you have neuropathy or chronic pain or a bum transplant of some sort that you've had to just deal with for a long time? Is your biggest need for healing emotional, getting over some trauma that you can't forget? Is it mental? Is it spiritual? One question we can ask ourselves is, if I were healed from that affliction, what in my life would change? And what would stay the same? If I was healed of this, if I no longer had to deal with this, what would change in my life and what wouldn't? If God came to you in a dream or a vision and said, I need you to still have this affliction. I'm sorry, but I need you to have this until you get to heaven. How would you respond to that? What would it mean to you if you knew this is part of a plan? You're going to need to trust me. If Helen Keller had been healed, we wouldn't be talking about her today. And we wouldn't have learned all sorts of different modes of communication that have helped blind and deaf people for generations. So what can you and I do? What control do we have over all this? Jesus says, you've got control over something very important. Be open.